Without further ado, Jeff Mann's going to give a talk, and I'm not even going to try to pronounce that, so that's what he's giving a talk, and I'm just going to point. Oh, now it's changed. Evolution of Cryptography with Jeff Mann. Everyone please give a big round of applause for Jeff.
Thank you, thank you. So that's cool. If I walk in front of it, I'm not blocking it, I'll just block your view. I saw Chris Roberts last week at CornCon. Anybody happen to be there or hear about his talk? He's dealing with a lot of stuff, and he was pretty sure he wasn't going to make it this week. I could almost give the talk that he gave, but I'll leave it to him to do that. So I happen to have an extra slide deck, and I said, yeah, I'd be happy to give a talk. So we'll get right into it. This is my name, information. I've been doing information security for 40 years. I started out as a cryptographer at NSA, National Security Agency, back in the 80s. I've actually worked at the time what was both sides, offense and defense, operations and information security. So I have broken codes as well as designed codes and crypto systems. I've been out in the private sector for quite a few years. I've spent 20 years doing PCI. Don't hate me. I love it, and I hate it too. This is a deck that I just grabbed, so there's a little bit of stuff I might breeze through here, but we're all kind of coming out of COVID. We haven't necessarily been to a lot of conferences lately, so things that have been going on the last couple years. I was a QSA, I wasn't, I am again. That's a qualified security assessor. That's who does the PCI assessment. I'm on a podcast called Paul's Security Weekly. We actually just recorded our 800th episode last week. The podcast has been going on for 17 years. I've been doing it for about 8 years. I had my own show, but they canceled it. I'm in a book called Tribe of Hackers. In fact, it's a series. All this to say is I've been around a lot, and people like to hear what I have to say just because I have a lot of experience. I'm in a group called Hack for Kids, and I'm focusing finally on trying to do Hack for Kids, which is kind of like Children of the CornCon. It's a hacker conference, but for young people, middle school, in fact, as young as age 7 up through high school, trying to teach hacking skills and this stuff that we love doing to getting it to a younger age group so that they can discover the possibilities and grow up and be like us. I did some work with the Special Forces back when I was at NSA in the downtime the last couple years. Met a guy, ex-Green Beret. Long story short, he got me in a life membership in their alumni association. I'm a civilian, I was never in the military, but I am an honorary lifetime member of the Special Forces Association because I invented a little cipher wheel that helped them do their secure communications. I've been interviewed on many podcasts, Darknet Diaries, Malicious Life, and others. I have a granddaughter that end of 2021 was diagnosed with stage 4 Hodgkin's lymphoma. So I spent most of 22 dealing with that, radiation chemotherapy, immunocompromised. The good news is she's come out of it and she's 18 months cancer-free now and started high school a month ago. Yes, that is worthy of applause. So when I say I've been coming out of it, it wasn't just COVID, it was 2 years of COVID and then a year of cancer, and this has been the first year where I feel like I'm back anyway. But a little bit of cryptographic history. I had the idea to put this thing together because one of my many idiosyncrasies is I think in our industry and business that words have meanings, and because I have a cryptographic background, I hear a lot of cryptographic terms thrown around. And, we all know that crypto doesn't mean cryptography anymore, it's that other thing. And it's not just that, but just mostly terms like encryption and encoding and decrypting and decoding and this, that, and the other. Where I came from, they had specific meanings, and so I wanted to kind of put together a talk to just kind of, let's go through the history of cryptography and what this terminology, where it came from and what it means, and hopefully it's helpful. Hopefully it means something to you guys. If not, it eases a burden for me because I can at least share with you, do with it what you will. It's also a little bit of a greatest hits slide deck for me, because I at various times tell different stories about cryptography, and I thought, well, why don't I just pull it together in one talk on cryptography? So the idea of cryptography should not be surprising to you, but it's the idea of keeping secrets. And for most of history, the idea of keeping secrets was mostly in terms of communication. I want to get a message to somebody else. I am a commander of troops in the battlefield. I'm a dictator, ruler, king, president, and want to tell my troops to go do something, or tell my trusted friends and allies to do something. And we want to be able to win a battle, win a war. A lot of it has to do with the military. A lot of it has to do with armed conflict, but also, engaging in commerce and so on and so forth. I mean, that's the roots of it. Obviously, it applies now in our modern world in so many different ways. But it's an old idea. And historically, from the early days, there was basically, and I'm talking thousands of years ago, there was basically two different ways of keeping secrets, and that was codes or ciphers. And again, these are things that are different and have different meanings, but oftentimes today these terms are kind of bandied about and used almost synonymously. How many people did the Lintiles game yesterday? Anybody? Couple people? He had a question about early cipher systems, and we had a long talk afterwards because what he thought was the wrong answer, I said, technically it's the right answer. And he acquiesced, which is unusual for him. American Revolution. Everybody's probably familiar with the poem by Longfellow, the Paul Revere's Ride. I just wanted to use that as a brief example. The idea of one light if by land and two lights if by sea, that's an example of a code. It's something that means a thought or an idea or a phrase. And that's essentially the definition of a code. A code is a way to shorten and make secret or scramble a word or phrase or thought or idea, as opposed to a cipher, which typically is scrambling your message one character at a time. So this is what I had like a 2-hour argument with Lintile last night about. By definition, code is scrambling words, sentences, thoughts, ideas. Cipher is character by character. In the American Revolution, they did a lot of cryptography and they used a lot of codes. This is an example of a code that was used primarily up in the New York, Long Island area. It's hard to read probably at a great distance, but basically they had numbers assigned to words. They had numbers assigned to officers in the military, the Congress, individuals, people, divisions of the armies and the militia and so on and so forth. As an example, George Washington, his code number was 711. So they could send messages just using the numbers, and then they had a code book to look up what the word meant that the number was representing. There were ciphers used during the American Revolution. This particular one is called Benjamin Church, and it's not a letter for letter substitution, it's a weird character substitution. But it's essentially the same thing as a Caesar cipher. It's a character that represents a letter. Speaking of Caesar cipher, they were used during the American Civil War. The Confederates had a cipher disk that they would use, and the way that they would do this is, I don't know specifically, I'm guessing, but let's say on a daily basis, they would tell everybody to align the letter F with the letter W, and then for that day, that was the rotation of the alphabet that they would use to encrypt or encipher their messages to and from. These slides are from, I gave a talk a couple years ago at a Masonic lodge, so that's why there's a lot of American Revolution and now the Masons. The Masons actually used a form of cipher, and you can see it on these tombstones. They would leave messages for all eternity using this cipher system that they called a pig pen cipher. Pigpen cipher is taking these geometric shapes, writing the letters out, and then using the shape of the box or the cell that the letter falls in as the cipher. So we can see what that looks like here. Is there a reverse on this? Yeah. So you see like the letter A is the top left corner of like a tic-tac-toe grid, and so on and so forth. It's still a simple substitution. Anybody ever seen the movie National Treasure? They talk about the Ottendorf cipher. It was kind of sort of real in those days, in the revolutionary times, but it was actually called the Arnold cipher. And it's what's commonly known to as a book cipher, where the numbers translate to the page of a book, the line on the page, and the character just going left to right across that line. Could have been a word, but often, at least in the movie, it was depicted as a single letter, which makes it a cipher. But it also could be a code if it happened to just point to like the word on the page or the line. The other form of scrambling that falls under this idea of cipher is what's called a transposition cipher, where you're using the same letters, you're just mixing them up. One way that was done, I think, by the Egyptians was they would write letters out on a leather strap that was wrapped around a rod or a stick of a particular size, and then they'd unwind it and have this big long, leather thong strand. And the only way they thought it could be read is if it was wrapped around the same sized rod on the other end. Another way is to use some sort of template that blocks out certain characters in a grid. So you're writing your message out on the exposed characters and then turn your template a quarter turn and keep going. So that's a way to transpose a message. The difference is substitution is you're using a different letter, a different character, but it's representing a letter. Whereas a transposition, it's all the letters, they're all there. They're just mixed up in some jumbled order that supposedly somebody can't figure out how to de-jumble it. One of the advancements to try to make it a little bit harder is something called a Playfair cipher, where you write your alphabet out in a grid, and usually it could have been the standard alphabet, or it could be based on a keyword, in this case monarchy. You use those letters of the alphabet, and then you fill in the rest of the table with the letters that you haven't used. Because there's only 25 squares and there's 26 letters in the English alphabet, I and J were often combined because J is a pretty uncommon letter. And most people can figure out, if they're trying to write out a word, whether that letter should have been an I or should have been a J. The way it works essentially is when you take your message 2 letters at a time, find them in the table. Oh, I guess I have to talk through the whole thing. Wait, sorry, wrong button. You sort of match like the AT is an example. A's on the top right, or top left, T's on the top right. So you try to create a square, why they call it a Playfair square, and complete a square, and technically a rectangle. So the cipher letters become R and S. So left to right, top to bottom, you sort of do that in mirror image order. If it's on the same row, you do the row below. If it's on the same column, you do the column to the right, and so on and so forth. Getting up to World War II, probably everybody's heard about the Navajo code talkers. Their messages were never broken by the enemy, the Japanese. This was happening in the Pacific Theater. Not only because they were using a code, using different words to represent words, thoughts, ideas, but they were also doing it in their native language. And the words that they used to represent, it seems intuitive to me today, but it somehow was elusive to the Japanese. But the Navajo word that they used to represent, looking down at the bottom, for example, a battleship, which is a big ship, they used the Navajo word for whale. For some reason, the Japanese couldn't ever figure that out. That's an example of a code. And then getting back to National Treasure, there's other ways to try to hide your messages, like invisible ink and stuff like that. A fun way that was used in the American Revolution was to hide your messages within letters, and it was just a matter of knowing which words were really part of the intended message or not. One documented example is something called the Clinton-Burgoyne, I don't know how you say that name, Burgoyne letter, where the message was basically written inside, again, a template that was written out, and then other words were added to make it seem like an innocuous, newsy letter without any real meaning. And then, of course, the movie goes on to reveal hidden writings, invisible inks, and something like that. So that's a little bit of the history up to a certain point. What I did at NSA for a part of my career was cryptanalysis, and this is code breaking. This is what NSA is or was known for: intercepting communications, breaking the code, breaking the cipher, figuring out what the underlying message was. When I was there, it was mostly paper systems. This was largely before the digital age, where things are done mostly mathematically by computers now. A lot of this was done dating back to World War I and World War II by hand, and was done using mathematical methods, perhaps, but a lot of it was manual. The way it typically starts is with whatever message you get. You've got characters. You simply start by counting them to see what kind of patterns are emerging. And it's based on knowledge of whatever you believe the underlying language that is written in, what are the frequencies of the letters used. We'll use English as an example. This is the frequency of letters in English. It may or may not come as a surprise to you that the most common letter in the English language is the letter E. So when you're trying to solve a crypto puzzle or a Caesar cipher or something like that, and you're counting the occurrences of whatever the letters are, generally the letter that shows up the most of the time, not all the time, is probably the letter E. But you can start there and start looking for patterns of words and see if you can guess other letters and see if it's consistent. That's essentially what is the cryptanalysis that I used to do a million years ago. I'll show you an example. This is the preamble to the Constitution. Most of us are at least familiar with the first line. And the frequency count of the letters that are in this snippet of English language is I found a tool online that did all this stuff for me, which was kind of cool. So that's the frequency of the letters in that paragraph. When you scramble it and you've done some sort of simple substitution, again, it's a letter for letter substitution, so the pattern doesn't change. It's just the overall pattern, if you have it spelled out A to Z, is different. So looking at the patterns here, the most commonly used letter in this jumbled mess is Y. And if just looking up at the top, we know it says we the people, we can see, yeah, Y is the E. And it goes from there. And it's not just the peaks. We actually referred to this as peaks and valleys. There's letters that are used a lot, and there's letters that are hardly ever used. Letters like Q and Z and J, less frequency letters. So you're not only looking for patterns in terms of the frequency, but also the infrequency. I said all that, and I actually had highlights. To make it a little bit more complicated, over time, people came up with fancier ways of basically doing a Caesar cipher by introducing a key letter or a key word. Instead of doing A to Z and some offset of A to Z, they might pick a word like Charlie, and again, write out the rest of the letters that haven't been used, and use that as the offset. They thought that was more complicated. It's not really if you're just looking for frequency and patterns. Different types of key settings and introducing the idea of random streams of key. which is essentially what we're doing in modern cryptography and digital cryptography. We're coming up with keys that are, thousands and thousands of bytes long that are applied to the messages and the traffic that's being communicated, with the idea that computationally, assuming that you have to try all the combinations, it just can't be done. There's not enough computing power and not enough time, but they calculate how much time it takes to what's called brute forcing it. But back in the manual days, the idea that you would, as I said, put a word in front of instead of just the standard alphabet, that was a way to make it a little bit more complicated. What was more common, though, was to start using different alphabets. And the slide of the alphabet was based, again, on a keyword, only this time, every time you were going to do a substitution, it was from a different alphabet, a different slide of the alphabet. What does this look like? It looks something like this. And just to point out, message traffic back in those days was often sent over radio, very often by Morse codes. Somebody was tapping these things out. And in doing this research, the books that I was using as reference, which I'll show you in a little bit, I learned this, I didn't know it, but for some reason, 5 is the number that's like the maximum number that is reasonable for people to send at one time and hear it and remember it and be able to write it down. So just everything that we ever saw in terms of message traffic was grouped in 5 characters. If you do a frequency count of that just the way it is, that doesn't look a lot like what we were seeing before with the frequency of the English language. Every letter's used. That's unusual. There's no real distinct peaks and valleys the way it is in the regular standard alphabet. So that's a good clue that there's something else going on more complicated than just a simple substitution. So let's look at trying to figure out how many alphabets were used. Again, I used some program that I found online to do this, but this is doing it assuming that there's 2 alphabets. So every other letter was counted and the frequency came up with it. For reference, this is the overall distribution. This is what we're going for, English distribution, and that's what we got with 2 alphabets. Does that look like the message was done with 2 alphabets? Somebody say yes or no? Head nodding doesn't work. I'm way far away from you. Let's try 3 alphabets. How does that look? Does that look like that's the right number of alphabets? No. 4 starts to look a little bit more interesting. There's still some peaks and valleys, but still several of the offsets, you're using almost all the letters. So it kind of looks like we're getting closer, but it's still maybe not right. Trying 5 alphabets, though, things start to appear. Like the first alphabet, it's actually the actual English distribution, if you look at it, just a little bit offset, but that looks pretty good. The 4th alphabet, most common letter is E. Look at that. Now, there's still some weirdness in here, but this is looking a lot more from just looking at the patterns, the peaks and the valleys that we'd expect to see. We don't expect to see all the letters being used. So let's check our work. Just taking the very beginning, and again, we know it says, "We the people of the United States," so we know what the underlying text is. We know what the E's are, for example, in this. And we're seeing the letters, and let's also count which offset they are, and then look at the table. So in the second alphabet, M, we know is really the letter E, and we look at that, it's the most common letter. This is looking pretty good. The 5th alphabet, V, we know to be the E. That's our hypothesis. Well, the V's not the most common letter in that, but that's okay. It's still pretty high. Moving on to the next instance, the 2nd alphabet. We've done that already. Skip to the next one, the 1st alphabet, and G. Yep, that's up there. This is looking pretty good. This is the type of thing that we were doing generally by hand and counting in our heads to try to figure out how many alphabets were involved. And then once we did that, very often we would plug it into computer programs that would, once we knew what the offset was, and if we solved one message, we could figure out what the underlying keyword was, maybe, and then we could solve all the message traffic that was being intercepted that used this particular method. So again, in terms of terminology, to me at least, it's important to point out that very few cryptographic systems and algorithms are actually broken. Very often it's brute forcing. The DES algorithm that was quote unquote broken, gosh, how many years ago has that been? How many? 15? I don't know, it's been a while. But it was done by distributed processing. You know, they figured out, well, let's throw more than one computer trying all the combinations, and they were able to pretty quickly break it by using a whole bunch of different computers. It was still brute force. The algorithm wasn't broken. There were no shortcuts discovered. Cryptanalysis, the way it was done when I was doing it, it was finding shortcuts. It was finding a way to not have to do brute force, looking for patterns, looking for different things that would help us figure out what the underlying algorithm was, or in many cases, what the keys that were being used on the machine systems that were generating. If you've seen the movie Imitation Game, know the story of the Enigma machine, that's exactly what was happening there. They were brute forcing, trying every combination, and the key settings on the Enigma machine were changed daily. So they had only a certain amount of time to try to figure out all the combinations to get back to what the key settings were, what the rotor settings were on the Enigma. But the way they initially broke it and could speed up that process was a limitation and a weakness that was introduced because the Germans, by rule, would start every one of their messages with Heil Hitler. So at the beginning of the day, a new rotor, they started intercepting traffic. They knew that the first 8 or 10 or 12 characters, however high Hitler is, 10 characters, they knew what the underlying message was. And so that was a way to kickstart. We don't have to try, in doing all the combinations, brute force, we know what the answer is. And once we get that, it sort of jumps you forward. That's a cryptographic attack. When you have underlying plain text, when you know what it is. Another way that was very common is, still staying on the Enigma machine, after Heil Hitler, anything went. But knowing that once you had the beginnings of the key rotations and they knew how the Enigma machine worked and they had multiple messages, they could start trying, okay, what do we think the next register setting is, or the next couple register setting is on this message? That forms a word. Let's try the same settings on the next message. Those letters that are popping out, that doesn't solve a word, so let's go back and try a different set of combinations. That forms a word. Second one, that also forms a word. Third one, that also forms a word. We know we've got the right register setting. That technique is called depth. When you know it's the same key being used for multiple messages, you can try your guesses across different messages and more quickly tell if you're getting on the right track and you find the right guess. That's depth. And then there's the underlying plain text, the Heil Hitler. You know that that's the same. That's also a cryptographic technique. I worked mostly with something that was called a one-time pad. A one-time pad is basically random key that's generated and printed out on paper, and the idea is you write your message out character for character, one letter or one character at a time. You do some sort of algorithm to come up with a cipher letter. You send that. The person on the other end has a copy of the same key, writes down the cipher, he has the same key. The algorithm is reversible in the sense that he'll get back the plain text letter, which was your intended message. That's kind of hard to envision, so let's see what it looks like. The one-time pad that I worked with U.S. Special Forces was based on something called a visionaire table, which was the alphabet with 26 offsets, but it was the reverse alphabet. That, for some reason, I've never done the math, translates to this many unique three-letter combinations. When I was working with the Green Berets, they would memorize these things so they could do the encryption and decryption in their head. This is what it looked like. This is the wheel that I came up with, which was, for me, a cheat on how to do that thing because I didn't have the letters memorized. And, you know, it got me into Special Forces Association. This is what it looked like. So this is a mock-up of what a one-time pad would look like. Characters written randomly, 5 at a time. The way it worked was you would skip the first 5 characters and start writing out your message a character at a time, because in transmission, when the other side received it, they'd look at the first 5 characters and they'd find the page. In theory, it was the next page, but had the same 5 characters. That's how they knew which page to do the decryption on. So you would write out your message one at a time, do that table lookup, you had it memorized, the 3-letter combinations, you'd use my wheel, you'd get the cipher message. That would be what was transmitted, and again, they were usually tapping it out with Morse code, and they would do it as quickly as they can because there was a communications operator that had to turn on a radio, set up an antenna. In fact, very often they would read it into something that would then do a burst communication. It would compress it and send it out, because the longer that they were on the air, the more likelihood the enemy would be able to direction find the signal and start lobbing bombs at them. On the other side, the person that receives it, he writes down the same message. Magically, the 3-letter combination gets back to the message. That's what it looks like. I would love to be able to show people a real one-time pad, and just, I think it's easier to see the visual. Unfortunately, that's still considered ComSec material, communication security material, which means it's classified, which means I don't get to carry one around when I'm giving talks like this. But the effect of adding random key, like a one-time pad, and only using it one time is you've obliterated the patterns and the frequencies. And in fact, with a one-time pad, because the key is only used one time, any guess is equally valid in terms of trying to get back to the message. Therefore, a one-time pad cannot be broken. It is unbreakable. There's no such thing as brute forcing a one-time pad. The only time it gets broken is if A, they use the page more than once, or B, somebody steals the page or has a copy of the page. That's the only way it's broken. Machine cryptography was a thing that was very common when I was at NSA, and you know, I talked about the Enigma machine. This is what most people think of when they think of machine cryptography. Interesting to me was I started at the National Security in 1986, and at the time, the knowledge that the Allies in World War II had actually broken the Enigma, that was still a secret. Anybody guess why it was still a secret? It was because somebody was still using the Enigma machine, which I found fascinating. I still to this day find fascinating, because I think most people, the consensus is that Polish cryptographers were the ones that originally broke the Enigma machine, figured out that they were saying Heil Hitler, and figured out a way, a cryptographic attack. Alan Turing, the Turing machine, the bomb, that was automation. That was the first computer. That was speeding up, trying all the combinations based on the cryptographic technique of we know what the first characters are. That was done in like the 38, 39 is when it was first broken, and it wasn't published that the Enigma was broken and compromised until like 88 or 89. That's 50 years. That's to this day, I think, an impressive feat. Not only that it was done, but that everybody was able to keep it a secret for that long. I more commonly was using this type of stuff, or the military at the time that I was dealing with were using radios that did encryption before it was sent, or it would take a voice signal that was analog and do some sort of encryption, or it would take an analog voice signal. Analog is the old-fashioned telephone, by the way. There's devices that would digitize the signal, and then the encryption would be done on the digits. And then on the other end, it would be decrypted, converted back to analog so you could listen to it. Very often, this was techniques that were used in secure telephones at the time, and it was very often the person on the other end sounded like Donald Duck or Daffy Duck. It was kind of weird. Frequency hopping was another thing that was done, because trying to hide the signal, trying to make sure it wasn't getting intercepted. So there was devices that were designed to actually randomly jump frequencies. So part of the message would be sent on this frequency, and then over here, and then randomly over here and over here. Anybody have any idea who came up with this idea of frequency hopping? Eddie Lamar, actress, but also a genius. She has actually had a patent for this idea. I think it was a patent of coming up with the idea of frequency hopping. These systems, because they used little black boxes that NSA designed that was based on key, the key had to get out to them, so there was also devices that would fill little, what we would know as, let's say it's equivalent of a USB stick, and it would fill it up with the key from a box that was generating the key or receiving it from us at NSA, and then those little boxes, USB stick type things, could be taken out to all the different radios, and the key could be injected or filled into the devices. There was the early days of digital encryption. This was something that was being promoted in the time that I was there. It was called a KL43. It was encryption. That little thing on the side is basically a portable modem coupler for a handset for a telephone. Those little rubber things would go on top of the handset so they could send and receive over a phone line. There's a little LED screen at the top. You could display like maybe 32 characters at a time. But it was basically type your message on a keyboard, the encryption happened, and it would transform into cipher, and that's what was sent. It was very awkward and clumsy to use. Then we started getting into cell phones. This is kind of after my time there. The secure telephone unit, that's something that I use. That's the one where you sounded like you were Donald Duck. Then you getting, now we're into modern times, what we're more familiar with. Somebody tell me how we're doing on time. What time is it? All right, I'll speed this up. Digital cryptography, we kind of know about this. It's based on the idea of keeping secrets, and in the digital age, we've added new features to the idea of data security. I don't want to dwell on that. There's basically two types, symmetric and asymmetric. I'm going to blows through that. Asymmetric public key cryptography, the Diffie-Hellman algorithm. Whit Diffie was the Diffie and Diffie-Hellman. I put him up here simply because when I was at NSA one time, I took a course from him that he taught. So I kind of sort of met him at one point. Very brilliant man, much smarter than me. Part of the genesis of this talk was to bitch about some of the, and talk about some of the things that are coming with cryptography, like quantum, something that's called homomorphic encryption. I don't want to dwell a whole lot on that because we're running out of time. We had a vendor that I met through the podcast that was introducing the idea of basically a virtual or electronic secure environment where, like in PCI, we talk about data transmission, data processing, and data storage. Data at rest, it's in a database, it's in a file, you encrypt that file, you encrypt the database, you encrypt the cell within the database. The transmission, what we're familiar with, HTTPS, VPNs, TLS protocols, and things like that. But nobody ever really came up with this whole idea of processing. How do you do processing of data securely? It's generally done on the computer in the memory. Sometimes it's written out to temporary storage. Sometimes it's written out to caches. Sometimes it ends up on the hard drive and you don't know it. But this one particular company, in a virtual sense, was coming up with a way to securely do the processing, which I thought was kind of fascinating, which is why I mentioned it more than those other things. When I was at NSA, we learned about Moore's Law. I always assumed that Moore was somebody at NSA and this was a deep, dark secret. Turns out it was public knowledge. And it holds true to this day, even I think in terms of quantum. But that's Moore's Law, which basically talks about the computing power and how fast it advances based on the advancement of technology. This was very important when we were designing crypto systems because we would have to design a system where the data was safe for, let's say, 10 years. So we would go to the Moore's algorithm and try to calculate how many years is it good before we think that this thing can be statistically brute forced and broken. And so we had to design things that we thought would be good 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years in the future, depending on what the sensitivity of the data was that was going to be used by the system. He actually just died, I think, earlier this year, but he turned out, he was somebody out in the civilian world. I like doing talks like this because I get to learn things. But, getting back to my original sort of thesis statement, the words have meaning and the cryptographic terms have meaning. The argument I had with Lintile last night was whether the meanings have evolved now in the digital age. We didn't come to a consensus, so I'll leave it to you guys to decide. But that was our podcast. We had debated this on some recent episode. That's why that slide was up there. Recent meaning in the last couple months. This is the Wikipedia definition of encryption, and it says, in cryptography, encryption is the process of encoding information. I looked this up while we were having this discussion on the podcast, and I'm like, well, no, that's not actually true. Encryption is not the process of encoding. Encryption, as we're going to learn in a minute, has a different meaning, and encoding has a different meaning. Security.com has this definition. Encryption is the method by which information is converted into secret code. And there's the use of the words encode and decode. We've got algorithms, we got ciphers, we've got plain text, we've got ciphertext. What does it all mean? In the last couple minutes, I would like to tell you what these all means. But again, I said this at the beginning, the main difference classically between code and cipher has to do with words and ideas and phrases that are being substituted with something versus a letter for letter type of idea of hiding or masking the data. I am certified as a cryptanalyst a million years ago. It's 2020, that's 30 years old. This is my source. These books were formally classified, but they were declassified because there's a magic marker that marked out confidential. That's proof that it's declassified. But I have the volume 1 and part 1 and part 2 of these books that were written by William Friedman and Lambros Kalimahos, pioneers of cryptography, especially back World War II, pioneers at NSA. In fact, the main auditorium at headquarters at NSA was named the Friedman Auditorium. Who are these people? Lambros Kalimahos, I can get you these slides later. I think this thing's being recorded. I'm not going to read all this thing to you. Basically, blah, 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 really smart guy, wrote a lot of the cryptographic courses at NSA, courses that I had to take, he wrote them, so on and so forth. Friedman, also a pioneer, again, going all the way back to World War I. Interestingly enough, William Friedman was married to a woman named Elizabeth Friedman, who was actually arguably more of an accomplished cryptographer than he was. So the auditorium, I think, is technically named for both of them. But a lot of people think that she's really more of the real deal, but in an era where men got a lot of the credit. She had a lot of success breaking cryptographic systems that were used by organized crime back during Prohibition. So she was helping break up illegal alcohol operations from Al Capone and the like back in those days. There's a lot of interesting things written about these guys. I'm not going to, we don't have time to try to read through all this stuff. They had a few conspiracy theories. They also liked to, they came up with this thing called the Baconian cipher, which was a way of doing encryption based on patterns of letters. And they had a belief that this was built in like to the writings of Shakespeare and stuff like that. I actually saw a talk a couple years ago at ShmooCon in DC, and somebody had figured out relatively recently that the message on the tombstone of the freedmen's "knowledge is power" was actually encrypted and ciphered with this Baconian cipher. And in fact, this is a class that they taught back in World War I, cryptography class. And somebody figured out also that in this photograph, if you look, the people are not just always looking straight forward. Sometimes they're looking left, sometimes they're looking to the right. It turns out that, shoot, I went in the wrong way again. It turns out that these guys in this photograph were grouped using the Baconian cipher to spell out "knowledge is power." I think it's all on there, yes. Google it, it's out there. I mean, there's websites about this and you can see it in much more detail. But this is basically how it works. And this person that was doing the research at ShmooCon, they found a note that was held in the collected writings and everything that they kept after the Freedmans died. And this was a note to the author of their biography that said, make sure that when my husband dies that this is the message and this is how it should be written. So it's kind of hard to see, but the fonts that are used on their tombstone are different fonts, and they map to the Baconian cipher. And it's "knowledge is power" actually translates with the cipher to the initials WFF, which were the initials of William Friedman. Kind of quirky and weird, but that's how crippies are. We're a lot like hackers, or maybe we are hackers. Anyway, that's who wrote this book. The definitions: to encrypt is to convert or transform a plain text message into a cryptogram by following certain rules, steps, or processes. And decrypt is the reverse of that. These are the generic terms that we should use in talking about any cryptographic system: encrypt, decrypt, not code, not cipher, encrypt, decrypt. So encrypting could be encoding, but it could also be enciphering, and so on and so forth. Again, codes and ciphers, this is what I was trying to tell Lintau last night, and if he's around today, is that you over there? Are you listening? I can't tell. No, that's not. If he's around, I'm going to share this with him because I didn't have it with me last night, but I swore to him it's in writing. There are actual definitions. The idea of key. How does a key, like a one-time pad or a key being used to key something like an Enigma machine, how does that change the definitions? It's all in here. More words on a screen that you have time to dig into. My company, I just quickly mentioned because they let me come here and talk to you guys. Online Business Systems for Pro Services. People like me and people that are smarter than me go out and help companies try to figure out how to do this thing we call cybersecurity. We have all sorts of offerings, blah, blah, blah. A lot of the credits that I got in this, the photo credits, are either an online site called the Crypto Museum or the National Cryptologic Museum, which, by the way, I presented one of my cipher wheels to a couple months ago. They're actually working on a display, so sometime in the next, I don't know how long, it's government or quasi-government, I'm going to be in a museum, which is kind of cool. Thank you. Any questions? If I can hear any of you. Questions, comments, or is it lunchtime? Hey, Wynn, how you doing? Did you learn anything? What? You'd never seen it? Okay.
Of life, not yet.
Hey, I don't want to keep you guys, but thank you for bearing with me as I pinch hit for Chris Roberts. Do keep him in your thoughts and whatever you do, higher power or not. If you heard about his talk at GurCon, he's got a lot on his plate right now. So if you know him, have a way of messaging him. He's on LinkedIn a lot. Send him a message. Just say, hey, missed you here. Jeff sort of filled in for you. Don't be mad at him, because he is trained to kill people in more ways than we know about. All right, thank you very much.